Our guest is David Adler, who's the president of the Australian Jewish Association and former Deputy Secretary of the AMA, the Australian Medical Association. Welcome, David.
And thank you, Professor David Flint, and good to join you again.
Well, thank you so much for doing this. One of the things that I find extraordinary is that the government has rushed into funding through UNRWA, even though the inquiry into UNRWA hasn't been completed, even though the Americans are not doing that. What is going on there, do you think?
There does seem to be an unseemly haste to shovel Australian taxpayer money towards UNRWA. And this is not the first time, David. The last Senate Estimates Committee had some really interesting questions by Liberal Senator Claire Chandler when she asked about compliance with the funding contract. Normally, 20% is held back subject to performance. This was a committee prior to the 7th of October. But the answer she got from the DFAT representative was the entire amount had been handed over to UNRWA. The entire 23-24 budget amount had been handed over to UNRWA without keeping the retention. And then, of course, we saw Foreign Minister Penny Wong restore the UNRWA funding after it had been suspended. And as you say correctly, there is an inquiry underway, but it's a very limited inquiry. The inquiry only looks at the allegation that UNRWA staff actively participated in the terrorism on 7th of October. The connections between Hamas and UNRWA are demonstrably much broader than that and much longer term than that. And you're right, the Americans have not restored the funding. In fact, they've gone a step further. Congress have passed a bill prohibiting funding of UNRWA for a further 12 months. They think that some alternative pathways need to be found, or UNRWA needs to undertake some very substantial reforms, which have not occurred. So we are acting in a manner that is contrary to our closest defence ally and contrary to the strategy of our ally in the Middle East, which of course is Israel. Israel has begun the legislative process through the Knesset to prohibit UNRWA operations in its sovereign territory, and Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu has announced that UNRWA will have no future in a post-war Gaza. So one can speculate the reasons why Penny Wong is so keen to hand over taxpayers' money to UNRWA, but it's an outrageous action, and I think is very clearly contrary to the behaviour of Australia's allies, and very disturbing for the Jewish community in this country too.
It's been very clearly established, has it not, that Hamas, the governing authority in the Strip, has used an extraordinary amount of money in building all those subterranean columns rather than in spending money on the population, and that the leaders of Hamas seem to be extraordinarily rich and are living the lives of billionaires. Is that not established?
There was a recent report in the New York Post, one of the New York publications, which estimated that the wealth of the top three Hamas leaders, who are all living in luxury in Qatar, was $11 billion. I mean, this is a super fortune in Middle East terms. And yet the international community seems not to worry. How did they accumulate that money? And nor is the international community asking them to actually return some of it to Gaza, because the only way they could have got that sort of money is frankly by stealing it from the foreign aid that naive countries like Australia and others have provided over many years. And you're right, the underground infrastructure, which has been exposed by the IDF since the 7th of October, it has been extraordinary. Tunnels that go kilometres of length, different levels, operation rooms underground. Many billions of dollars have been spent on that sort of terrorist infrastructure. And again, the only source of the funds and supplies to do that has been from the foreign aid that's been received. So this is an extraordinary situation, and one needs to be very, very cautious and sceptical about any additional funding and how it is applied going forward.
Now, Hamas clearly started this war by their terrible acts on the 7th of October. And what else could Israel do but defend herself? But we have the extraordinary action of the Security Council in passing a resolution calling for a ceasefire. And that's been done against the usual American practice. This was normal American practice of all administrations to block anything which is strongly opposed to Israel and to use their veto. But on this occasion, the United States did not use its veto. Well, what was going on there, do you think?
Well, you're absolutely right. It is extraordinary. And it's also flies in the face of the way Western countries have had to act when they have been combating extremists and terrorists in the past. I mean, you can look at many examples in modern history. When the Allies were fighting the Nazis, parts of Germany were absolutely devastated. No one was calling for a ceasefire in order to preserve the interests of the Nazis, through to more modern examples. And of course, there was a coalition combating ISIS, and there was significant conflict in Iraq. The Americans went after Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and no one was calling for a ceasefire. The objective was to complete the mission, to defeat those terrorist organisations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And fortunately, those missions succeeded. But unfortunately, there's always a cost in doing so. So everyone who's attacked by Islamist terrorist organisations is allowed to defend themselves, is allowed to combat, except Israel. It's not allowed to win the war. The international community wants to put the brakes on. It's outrageous. Israel has to complete the mission. It has to eliminate Hamas. There is no alternative. And frankly, it's in the interests of Western countries worldwide that that mission succeeds. Otherwise, it sends an extraordinarily powerful signal to the extremist groups that, hey, the West is weak, and if we persist long enough, we will get away with it. So what's going on here? We know it's an election year in America, and this is an issue that divides Republicans and Democrats. And there are some commentators saying that the Biden administration has more of an eye on domestic political considerations than on what is the right thing to do in terms of policy in the Middle East.
I think you're right there. Now, before you go, I'm sure you're as concerned as anybody who is concerned about Australia remaining a democratic society. You'd be very much concerned by what is an increasing toleration, a legal toleration of anti-Semitism by the New South Wales and the federal government and by federal authorities or some other authorities, including the Australian Human Rights Commission. They are treating Anti-Semitism is a different matter. They're trying to create the impression that there's such a thing as Islamophobia as a serious issue in Australia. If it is, it's a very minor issue in Australia. And this is very concerning, I find. Would you agree with that?
I think your assessment is very accurate. We have seen an explosion of anti-Semitism in Australia since the 7th of October, which frankly has surprised people in the Jewish community. We always knew there was a bit of grumbling anti-Semitism from the political left, from the Islamists. We have a few neo-Nazis in this country, but it has never really been so out in the open and so widespread as we've seen. And the signals from our law enforcement authorities and political leaders has been very weak. You and I have discussed before the immediate reaction which was on display in the courtyards of the Opera House on the 9th of October. And there we saw overt anti-Semitism in front of perhaps Australia's most iconic building, with chants of calling for an intifada and F the Jews and where's the Jews, and we would say also gas the Jews. And meanwhile, the only person who had law authority applied against him was a single Jewish guy with an Israeli flag. There has still to this day been no action taken by our authorities against these sort of vile demonstrations that began on the 9th of October and have continued around the country on a regular basis. We have had numerous threats. I've had a personal death threat with my name on it sent to me. We've had calls for boycotts of Jewish businesses, graffiti, stickers, online harassment. We've had 2 Jewish groups that have been doxed. In other words, their personal information released publicly, which has resulted in a wave of harassment and in some case significant damage to their work and business interests.
Well,
this is not
appalling.
Australia.
Yes, this is appalling.
It is. It is. And the lack of political leadership from the top seems to almost allow it.
Yes. Well, we'll have to keep at this because it's so significantly important, not only to the Jewish community, but to Australia itself. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Adler, and we shall certainly keep in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor David Flint. Always good.